This is a CBS News Special Report. President Biden's State of the Union address and the Republican response.
Good evening. I'm Norah O'Donnell here in the nation's capital. In just moments, President Biden will deliver his second State of the Union address, but his first in front of a divided Congress. The president tonight aims to tell the nation of his administration's accomplishments and discuss his legislative priorities. As you can see there, the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, sitting there with Vice President Kamala Harris's husband. Now, there is a complicated economic picture out there, not to mention issues of immigration, China, and Ukraine. The president tonight trying to overcome some pessimism still here in the country. Our new CBS News poll showed 62% of Americans say the country is divided. More than 40% say the U.S. is weak, and only 11% believe America is prospering. A majority of Americans currently believe that President Biden's policies are making inflation, gas prices, and the overall economy worse. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes. Nancy, what do we expect to hear from the president tonight?
Well, White House officials stress that this is going to be an optimistic speech, that he is going to stress his accomplishments from the first 2 years, because that polling you just mentioned indicates that a lot of Americans still don't know what he accomplished in those first 2 years. So he's going to remind them. He's going to talk about economic progress in this country. He's going to lay out the issues that he thinks he can work on with Republicans in the years to come. And he's going to have to, because there you see the House Speaker. It's a Republican now, Kevin McCarthy. He needs to work with Republicans if he wants to get anything done. And there, of course, is the outgoing Speaker, Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, different not seeing her up there on the podium. Our chief political analyst, John Dickerson, here as well. This is a moment and an occasion for the president to speak directly to the American people.
It is. And Nancy lays out all of his plans and hopes and dreams. But, you know, when you think about what our polling shows people care the most about, they want to hear what he has to say about inflation and the economy. Two things that were roiled by two events, the COVID-19 pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine. Two things that were surprises, which reminds us that the presidency is all about getting knocked off your game. No matter how many plans he has for the world, he's going to face difficulties and challenges that aren't even known yet. And that's important to think about when he lays out all of these promises and as he makes the case tonight in his soft launch for his next presidential run.
Also with us, Robert Costa, the president entering his third year in office, a Republican-controlled House. It's going to be very hard for him to get anything done. And, of course, the discussion will shift in many ways to politics and whether he's seeking re-election.
President Biden tonight facing a multi-front war with Republicans. It's not just House Republicans who are investigating him and his family. It's the looming 2024 presidential field. There'll be a Republican response tonight from the new Arkansas governor, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And I just got off the phone a few minutes ago with Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia. He and so many other Republicans tonight want to go hard on President Biden, on China, and there's some aversion inside the House about whether to spend more on Ukraine.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
And there you see President Biden introduced by the new Sergeant of Arms, William McFarland, appointed by Speaker Kevin McCarthy. He is a former U.S. Capitol Police member, escorting Joe Biden, who has spent a lot of time over his half-century-long career in Washington as a United States Senator for decades and then as Vice President of the United States. He knows many of these members well and by name. I want to bring in Margaret Brennan, moderator of Face the Nation. And while this will largely be about domestic issues, foreign policy front and center, not only because the anniversary of the war in Ukraine is coming up at the end of this month, support may be waning in Congress, but also, too, the issue of China and that spy balloon that the president shot down last weekend.
Well, and those two things you just mentioned, China and Russia, huge impact on the global economy. So if his message is, less bad is his winning phrase versus very good, he also has to solve for those two big competitions. And one of them is Russia's ability to continue driving up oil prices. You hear the president talk about the war in Ukraine, trying to keep the Western alliance together and united against that. And also, by extension, hit big oil for profiting off of the run-up in oil prices because of that. On China, you will hear him talk about that global competition in technology and military and all that. You won't hear him say balloon. I'm told they are avoiding talking about this specific aerial surveillance program that Congress has been briefed on and will be briefed further, and instead frame it as a competition between global powers. It's avoiding the one thing Americans can look to as a concrete example of espionage, but they are avoiding it so as to lower the temperature on that competition between the United States and China, which is the chief adversary of the United States on all of those fronts, economic, technological, and military. So the one thing you do find bipartisan agreement on in that Congress right now is that the main worry is China. More needs to be done, but exactly how to do it remains an open question. I know Speaker McCarthy has said he wants to keep this voice united when it comes to competition.
Just a quick moment for people who watch every year the State of the Union and are closely or eagle-eyed watchers of who the president is talking to or who may be escorting him. The woman with the gray hair that was escorting him is the Senate Sergeant of Arms, former Lieutenant General in the Army, Karen Gibson, spent 3 decades an intelligence specialist, combat veteran there as well, escorting the president inside. Let's bring in Scott McFarland because he is there and can see everything that's happening. Scott?
Here's what I didn't see, Nora. He didn't shake the hand of embattled New York Congressman George Santos, who had positioned himself 90 minutes ago on the aisle in position to shake the president's hand. It didn't happen, avoiding a photo op that may not have been beneficial to either side. I'll also note Nancy Pelosi, several rows back, just looks different. And on that center aisle, we saw him shaking hands as he entered. That was such a pivotal spot, Nora, a few weeks ago during that House Speaker vote. The Republican faction, who at first denied and defied Kevin McCarthy, now it's been replaced by people who want to greet the president.
Thank you so much, Scott McFarland. And as you saw there, an unusually large contingent of Supreme Court justices there shaking President Biden's hand. Also, Steve Scalise, the number 2 House Republican behind him. The president now speaking the hands of military leaders gathered there. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, as well as the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. The president's been spending a lot of time with them anyway the past weekend as he was dealing with what to do with that spy balloon and the recommendation. He wanted to shoot it down. According to White House officials, they said, wait, they were concerned about large pieces of that balloon falling down, hitting a school bus or people or anyone. They were concerned that it was concerned about that.
And we're now seeing really remarkable pictures of that balloon being recovered from the sea. You know, most of the cabinet is there tonight, Nora, but there's always one member of the cabinet who stays behind in an undisclosed location just in case. Tonight, that honor falls to Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, who could become the first of the president's cabinet members to actually depart because he has been reported to be considering a job running the National Hockey Players Union.
We saw Hakeem Jeffries, first black leader of a major party in Congress, another historic presence tonight.
2 handshakes with the new speaker.
I was just about to say, yeah, they're both on their best behavior.
It's a high privilege and a distinct honor to present to you the President of the United States.
A very warm reception for President Joe Biden.
Mr. Speaker.
You know, the Republicans are now in control of the House, so this is their first night in control. There were outbursts last year. You know, any one outburst now defines a body. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's a different atmosphere for the Republicans.
Well, let's listen in.
Mr. Speaker, Madam Vice President, our First Lady and Second Gentleman, good to see you guys up there. Members of Congress. By the way, Chief Justice, I may need a court order. She gets to go to the game tomorrow, next week. I have to stay home. Got to work something out here. Members of the Cabinet, leaders of our military, Chief Justice, Associate Justice, and retired Justice of the Supreme Court, and to you, my fellow Americans. I start tonight by congratulating the 118th Congress and the new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. Speaker, I don't want to ruin your reputation, but I look forward to working with you. And I want to congratulate the new leader of the House Democrats, the first African-American minority leader in history, Hakeem Jeffries. He won in spite of the fact I campaigned for him. Congratulations to the longest-serving leader in the history of the United States Senate, Mitch McConnell. Where are you, Mitch? And congratulations to Chuck Schumer, another term as Senate Minority Leader. I think you. Only this time you have a slightly bigger majority, Mr. Leader. You're the majority leader. About that much bigger? Yeah. Well, I tell you what. I want to give special recognition to someone who I think is going to be considered the greatest speaker in the history of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. Folks, the story of America is a story of progress and resilience, of always moving forward, of never, ever giving up. It's a story unique among all nations. We're the only country that has emerged from every crisis we've ever entered stronger than we got into it. Look, folks, that's what we're doing again. 2 years ago, the economy was reeling. I stand here tonight after we've created, with the help of many people in this room, 12 million new jobs, more jobs created in 2 years than any president's created in 4 years, because of you all, because of the American people. 2 years ago, and 2 years ago, COVID had shut down, our businesses were closed, our schools were robbed of so much, and today, COVID no longer controls our lives. And 2 years ago, democracy faced its greatest threat to the Civil War. And today, though bruised, our democracy remains unbowed and unbroken. As we gather here tonight, we're writing the next chapter in the great American story, a story of progress and resilience. When world leaders ask me to define America, and they do, believe it or not, I say I can define it in one word, and I mean this: possibilities. We don't think anything is beyond our capacity. Everything is a possibility. We're often told that Democrats and Republicans can't work together. But over the past 2 years, we've proved the cynics and naysayers wrong. Yes, we disagreed plenty. And yes, there were times when Democrats went alone. But time and again, Democrats and Republicans came together to defend a stronger and safer Europe. You came together to pass once in a generation infrastructure law, building bridges connecting our nation and our people. We came together to pass the most significant law ever, helping victims exposed to toxic burn pits. And in fact, it was important. And in fact, I signed over 300 bipartisan pieces of legislation since becoming president, from reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, the Electoral Count Reform Act, the Respect for Marriage Act that protects the right to marry the person you love, and to my Republican friends, If we could work together the last Congress, there's no reason we can't work together and find consensus on important things in this Congress as well. I think folks, you all are as informed as I am, but I think the people sent us a clear message. Fighting for the sake of fighting, power for the sake of power, conflict for the sake of conflict gets us nowhere. That's always been my vision of our country, and I know it's many of yours. To restore the soul of this nation, to rebuild the backbone of America, America's middle class, and to unite the country. We've been sent here to finish the job, in my view. For decades, the middle class has been hollowed out in more than, and not no one administration, but for a long time. Too many good-paying manufacturing jobs move overseas. Factories closed down. Once thriving cities and towns that many of you represent became shadows of what they used to be. And along the way, something else we lost: pride, our sense of self-worth. I ran for president to fundamentally change things, to make sure our economy works for everyone, so we can all feel that pride in what we do. To build an economy from the bottom up and the middle out, not from the top down. Because when the middle class does well, the poor have a ladder up, and the wealthy still do very well. We all do well. I know a lot of you always kid me for always quoting my dad, but my dad used to say, Joey, a job's about a lot more than a paycheck. He really would say this. It's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about respect. It's about being able to look your kid in the eye and say, honey, it's going to be okay, and mean it. Well, folks, so let's look at the results. We're not finished yet by any stretch of the imagination, but unemployment rate is at 3.4%, a 50-year low. A near record unemployment. Near record unemployment for Black and Hispanic workers. We've already created, your help, 800,000 good-paying manufacturing jobs, the fastest growth in 40 years. And where is it written? Where is it written that America can't lead the world in manufacturing? And I don't know where that's written. For too many decades, we imported projects and exported jobs. Now, thanks to what you've all done, we're exporting American products and creating American jobs. Folks, inflation has been a global problem because the pandemic disrupted our supply chains, and Putin's unfair and brutal war in Ukraine disrupted energy supplies as well as food supplies, blocking all that grain in Ukraine. But we're better positioned than any country on earth right now. But we have more to do. But here at home, inflation is coming down. Here at home, gas prices are down $1.50 from their peak. Food inflation is coming down, not fast enough, but coming down. Inflation has fallen every month for the last 6 months, while take-home pay has gone up. Additionally, over the last 2 years, a record 10 million Americans applied to start new businesses. 10 million. And by the way, every time someone starts a small business is an act of hope. And Madam Vice President, I want to thank you for leading that effort to ensure that small businesses have access to capital and the historic laws we enacted that are going to just come into being. Standing here last year, I shared with you a story of American genius and possibilities. Semiconductors, small computer chips the size of a fingerprint that power everything from cell phones to automobiles and so much more. These chips were invented in America. Let's get that straight. They were invented in America. We used to make 40% of the world's chips. In the last several decades, we lost our edge. We're down to only producing 10%. We all saw what happened during the pandemic when chip factories shut down overseas. Today's automobiles need 3,000 chips, each of those automobiles. But American automobiles couldn't make enough cars because there weren't enough chips. Car prices went up. People got laid off. So did everything from refrigerators to cell phones. We can never let that happen again. That's why we came together to pass the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act. Folks, I know I've been criticized for saying this, but I'm not changing my view. We're going to make sure the supply chain for America begins in America. The supply chain begins in America. We've already created 800,000 new manufacturing jobs without this law, before the law kicks in. With this new law, we're going to create hundreds of thousands of new jobs across the country. And I mean all across the country, throughout not just the coast, but through the middle of the country as well. That's going to come from companies that have announced more than $300 billion in investment in American manufacturing over the next few years. Outside of Columbus, Ohio, Intel is building semiconductor factories on 1,000 acres, literally a field of dreams. It's going to create 10,000 jobs, that one investment, 7,000 construction jobs, 3,000 jobs in those factories once they're finished. They call them factories. Jobs paying an average of $130,000 a year, and many do not require a college degree. Jobs. Because we work together, these jobs where people don't have to leave home to search for opportunity. And it's just getting started. Think about the new homes, the small businesses, the medium-sized businesses. So much more that's going to be needed to support those 3,000 permanent jobs and the factories that are going to be built. Talk to mayors and governors, Democrats and Republicans, and they'll tell you what this means for their communities. We're seeing these field of dreams transform to the heartland. But to maintain the strongest economy in the world, we need the best infrastructure in the world. And folks, as you all know, we used to be #1 in the world in infrastructure. We've sunk to 13th in the world. The United States of America, 13th in the world in infrastructure, modern infrastructure. But now we're coming back because we came together and passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, the largest investment in infrastructure since President Eisenhower's interstate highway system. And folks, already we've funded over 20,000 projects, including major airports from Boston to Atlanta to Portland. Projects that are going to put thousands of people to work rebuilding our highways, our bridges, our railroads, our tunnels, ports, airports, clean water, high-speed internet, all across America. Urban, rural, tribal. And folks, we're just getting started. We're just getting started. And I mean it sincerely. I want to thank my Republican friends who voted for the law, and my Republican friends who voted against it as well. But I still get asked to fund the projects in those districts as well. But don't worry. I promised I'd be a president for all Americans. We'll fund these projects. And I'll see you at the groundbreaking. Look, this law will further unite all of America. Projects like Brent Spence Bridge in Kentucky over the Ohio River, built 60 years ago, badly needed repairs, one of the nation's most congested freight routes, carrying $2 billion worth of freight every single day across the Ohio River. And folks, I've been talking about fixing it for decades, but we're really finally going to get it done. Yes. I went there last month with Democrats and Republicans, and from both states, to deliver a commitment of $1.6 billion for this project. And while I was there, I met a young woman named Sarah, who's here tonight. I don't know where Sarah is. Is she up in the box? I don't know. Sarah, how are you? Well, Sarah, for 30 years, I learned, she told me she'd been a proud member of the Iron Workers Local 44, known as the Cowboys in the Sky. The folks who built Cincinnati's skyline. Sarah said she can't wait to be 10 stories above the Ohio River building that new bridge. God bless her. That's pride. And that's what we're also building. We're building back pride. Look, we're also replacing poisonous lead pipes that go into 10 million homes in America, 400,000 school and child care centers. So every child in America can drink the water instead of having permanent damage to their brain. Look, we're making sure that every community in America has access to affordable high-speed internet. No parent should have to drive by McDonald's parking lot to help them do their homework online with their kids, which many thousands were doing across the country. And when we do these projects, and again I get criticized for this, but I make no excuses for it, we're going to buy American. We're going to buy American. Folks, and it's totally consistent with international trade rules. Buy America has been the law since 1933, but for too long, past administrations, Democrat and Republican, have fought to get around it. Not anymore. Tonight, I'm announcing new standards that require all construction materials used in federal infrastructure projects to be made in America. Made in America. I mean it. Lumber, glass, drywall, fiber optic cable. And on my watch, American roads, bridges, and American highways are going to be made with American products as well. Folks, my economic plan is about investing in places and people that have been forgotten. So many of you listening to me tonight, I know you feel it. So many of you felt like you've just simply been forgotten. Amid the economic upheaval of the past 4 decades, too many people have been left behind and treated like they're invisible. Maybe that's you watching from home. Remember the jobs that went away. You remember them, don't you? The folks at home remember them. You wonder whether the path even exists anymore for your children to get ahead without having to move away. Well, that's why I get that. That's why we're building an economy where no one's left behind. Jobs are coming back. Pride is coming back. Because choices we made in the last several years. You know, this is, in my view, a blue-collar blueprint to rebuild America and make a real difference in your lives at home. For example, too many of you lay in bed at night like my dad did, staring at the ceiling, wondering what in God's name happens if your spouse gets cancer or your child gets deadly ill, or something happens to you. What are you going to have? You get money to pay for those medical bills? Or are you going to have to sell the house or try to get a second mortgage on it? I get it. I get it. With the Inflation Reduction Act that I signed into law, we're taking on powerful interests to bring health care costs down so you can sleep better at night with more security. You know, we pay more for prescription drugs than any nation in the world. Let me say it again. We pay more for prescription drugs than any major nation on earth. For example, 1 in 10 Americans has diabetes. Many of you in this chamber do, and in the audience. But every day, millions need insulin to control their diabetes so they can literally stay alive. Insulin's been around for over 100 years. The guy who invented it didn't even patent it because he wanted it to be available for everyone. It costs the drug companies roughly $10 a vial to make that insulin. Packaging and all, you may get up to $13. But Big Pharma has been unfairly charging people hundreds of dollars, $400 to $500 a month, making record profits. Not anymore. Not anymore. So many things that we did are only now coming to fruition. We said we were doing this, and we said we passed the law to do it, but people didn't know because the law didn't take effect until January 1 of this year. We capped the cost of insulin at $35 a month for seniors on Medicare. People are just finding out. I'm sure you're getting the same calls I'm getting. Look, there are millions of other Americans who do not or are not on Medicare, including 200,000 young people with type 1 diabetes and need this insulin to stay alive. Let's finish the job this time. Let's cap the cost of insulin for everybody at $35. Folks, and Big Pharma is still going to do very well, I promise you all. I promise you they're going to do very well. This law also caps and won't even go into effect until 2025. It costs out-of-pocket drug costs for seniors on Medicare at a maximum of $2,000 a year. You don't have to pay more than $2,000 a year, no matter how much your drug costs are. Because you know why? You all know it. Many of you, like many in my family, have cancer. You know the drugs can range from $10,000, $11,000, $14,000, $15,000 for the cancer drugs. And if drug prices rise faster than inflation, drug companies are going to have to pay Medicare back the difference. And we're finally giving Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices. Bringing down prescription drug costs doesn't just save seniors money, it cuts the federal deficit by billions of dollars, by hundreds of billions of dollars, because these prescription drugs are drugs purchased by Medicare to keep their commitment to the seniors. Well, guess what? Instead of paying $400 or $500 a month, you're paying $15. That's a lot of savings for the federal government. And by the way, why wouldn't we want that? Now, some members here are threatening, and I know it's not an official party position, so I'm going to exaggerate, but threatening to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. As my coach, that's okay, that's fair. As my football coach used to say, lots of luck in your senior year. Make no mistake, if you try anything to raise the cost of prescription drugs, I will veto it. Look, I'm pleased to say that more Americans have health insurance now than ever in history. A record 16 million people are enrolled in the Affordable Care Act. And thanks to the law I signed last year, saving millions are saving $800 a year on their premiums. And by the way, that law was written and the benefit expires in 2025. So my plea to some of you, at least in this audience, let's finish the job and make these savings permanent. Expand coverage of Medicaid. Look, the Inflation Reduction Act is also the most significant investment ever in climate change. Ever. Lowering utility bills, creating American jobs, leading the world to a clean energy future. I visited the devastating aftermath of record floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires from Arizona to Mexico to all the way up to the Canadian border. More timber has been burned, as I've observed from helicopters, than the entire state of Missouri. And we don't have global warming? Not a problem. In addition to emergency recovery, from Puerto Rico to Florida to Idaho, we're rebuilding for the long term. New electric grids that are able to weather major storms and not prevent those forest fires. Roads and water systems withstand the next big flood. Clean energy to cut pollution and create jobs in communities often left behind. We're going to build 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations installed across the country by tens of thousands of IBEW workers. And we're helping families save more than $1,000 a year with tax credits to purchase electric vehicles and efficient appliances, energy-efficient appliances. Historic conservation efforts to be responsible stewards of our land. Let's face reality. The climate crisis doesn't care if you're in a red or blue state. It's an existential threat. We have an obligation, not to ourselves, but to our children and grandchildren to confront it. I'm proud of how America, at last, is stepping up to the challenge. We're still going to need oil and gas for a while. But guess what? No, we do. But there's so much more to do. We got to finish the job. And we pay for these investments in our future by finally making the wealthiest and biggest corporations begin to pay their fair share. Just begin. Look, I'm a capitalist. I'm a capitalist, but pay your fair share. I think a lot of you at home agree with me and many people that you know. The tax system is not fair. It is not fair. Look, the idea that in 2020, 55 of the largest corporations in America, the Fortune 500, made $40 billion in profits and paid zero in federal taxes? Zero? Folks, it's simply not fair. But now, because of the law I signed, billion-dollar companies have to pay a minimum of 15%. God love them. 15%. That's less than a nurse pays. And let me be crystal clear. I said at the very beginning, under my plans, as long as I'm president, nobody earning less than $400,000 will pay an additional penny in taxes. Nobody, not one penny. But let's finish the job. There's more to do. We have to reward work, not just wealth. Pass my proposal for the billionaire minimum tax. You know, there's 1,000 billionaires in America. It's up from about 600 in the beginning of the term. But no billionaire should be paying a lower tax rate than a school teacher or a firefighter. I mean it. Think about it. I mean, look. I know you aren't enthusiastic about that, but think about it. Think about it. Have you noticed Big Oil just reported its profits? Record profits. Last year, they made $200 billion in the midst of a global energy crisis. I think it's outrageous. Why? They invested too little of that profit to increase domestic production. And when I talk to a couple of them, they say, we're afraid you're going to shut down all the oil wells and all the oil refineries anyway, so why should we invest in them? I said, we're going to need oil for at least another decade. And that's going to exceed and beyond that. We're going to need it. Production. If they had, in fact, invested in the production to keep gas prices down, instead, they used the record profits to buy back their own stock, rewarding their CEOs and shareholders. Corporations ought to do the right thing. That's why I propose we quadruple the tax on corporate stock buybacks and encourage long-term investments. They'll still make considerable profit. Let's finish the job and close the loopholes that allow very wealthy to avoid paying their taxes. Instead of cutting the number of audits for wealthy taxpayers, I just signed a law to reduce the deficit by $114 billion by cracking down on wealthy tax cheats. That's being fiscally responsible. In the last 2 years, my administration has cut the deficit by more than $1.7 trillion, the largest deficit reduction in American history. Under the previous administration, the American deficit went up 4 years in a row. Because those record deficits, no president added more to the national debt in any 4 years than my predecessor. Nearly 25% of the entire national debt that took over 200 years to accumulate was added by just one administration alone, the last one. They're the facts. Check it out. Check it out. How did Congress respond to that debt? They did the right thing. They lifted the debt ceiling 3 times without preconditions or crisis. They paid American bills to prevent an economic disaster in the country. So tonight I'm asking the Congress to follow suit. Let's commit here tonight to the full faith and credit of the United States of America will never, ever be questioned. So some of my Republican friends want to take the economy hostage. I get it, unless I agree to their economic plans. All of you at home should know what those plans are. Instead of making the wealthy pay their fair share, some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy. I'll give you a copy of the proposal. That means Congress doesn't vote. Well, I'm glad to see you. And I tell you, I enjoy conversion. You know, it means if Congress doesn't keep the programs the way they are, they'd go away. Other Republicans say, I'm not saying it's a majority of you. I don't even think it's even a significant, but it's being proposed by individuals. I'm not politely not naming them, but it's being proposed by some of you. Look, folks, the idea is that we're not going to be moved into being threatened to default on the debt if we don't respond. Folks, as we all apparently agree, Social Security and Medicare is off the books now, right? They're not to be spent. All right. I'm ready. We got unanimity. Social Security and Medicare are a lifeline for millions of seniors. Americans have to pay into them from the very first paycheck they started. So tonight, let's all agree, and we apparently are, let's stand up for seniors. Stand up and show them. We will not cut Social Security. We will not cut Medicare. Those benefits belong to the American people. They earned it. And if anyone tries to cut Social Security, which apparently no one's going to do, and if anyone tries to cut Medicare, I'll stop them. I'll veto it. And look, I'm not going to allow them to be taken away. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But apparently it's not going to be a problem. Next month, when I offer my fiscal plan, I ask my Republican friends to lay down their plan as well. I really mean it. Let's sit down together and discuss our mutual plans together. Let's do that. I can tell you, the plan I'm going to show you is going to cut the deficit by another $2 trillion. And it won't cut a single bit of Medicare or Social Security. In fact, we're going to extend the Medicare Trust Fund at least 2 decades, because that's going to be the next argument. How do we keep it solvent, right? Well, we'll not raise tax on anyone making under $400 grand, but We'll pay for it the way we talked about tonight, by making sure that the wealthy and big corporations pay their fair share. Look. Here's the deal. They aren't just taking advantage of the tax code. They're taking advantage of you, the American consumer. Here's my message to all of you out there. I have your back. We're already preventing Americans from receiving surprise medical bills, stopping $1 billion surprise bills per month so far. We're protecting seniors' life savings by cracking down on nursing homes that commit fraud, endanger patient safety, prescribe drugs that are not needed. Millions of Americans can now save thousands of dollars because they can finally get a hearing aid over the counter without a prescription. Look, capitalism without competition is not capitalism. It's extortion. It's exploitation. Last year, I cracked down with the help of many of you on foreign shipping companies that were making you pay higher prices for every good coming into the country. I signed a bipartisan bill that cut shipping costs by 90%, helping American farmers, businessmen, and consumers. Let's finish the job. Pass the bipartisan legislation to strengthen antitrust enforcement and prevent big online platforms from giving their own products an unfair advantage. My administration is also taking on junk fees, those hidden surcharges too many companies use to make you pay more. For example, we're making airlines show you the full ticket price up front, refund your money if your flight is canceled or delayed. We've reduced exorbitant bank overdrafts by saving consumers more than $1 billion a year. We're cutting credit card late fees by 75%, from $30 to $8. Look, junk fees may not matter to the very wealthy, but they matter to most other folks in homes like the one I grew up in, like many of you did. They add up to hundreds of dollars a month. They make it harder for you to pay your bills or afford that family trip. I know how unfair it feels when a company overcharges you and gets away with it. Not anymore. We've written a bill to stop it all. It's called the Junk Fee Prevention Act. We're going to ban surprise resort fees that hotels charge on your bill. Those fees can cost you up to $90 a night at hotels that aren't even resorts. The idea that cable, internet, and cell phone companies can charge you $200 or more if you decide to switch to another provider. Give me a break. We can stop service fees on tickets to concerts and sporting events and make companies disclose all the fees up front. And we'll prohibit airlines from charging $50 round trip for a family just to be able to sit together. Baggage fees are bad enough. Airlines can't treat your child like a piece of baggage. Americans are tired of being. We're tired of being played for suckers. So pass the Junk Fee Prevention Act so companies stop ripping us off. For too long, workers have been getting stiffed, but not anymore. We're beginning to restore the dignity of work. For example, I should have known this, but I didn't until 2 years ago. 30 million workers have to sign non-compete agreements for the jobs they take. 30 million. So a cashier at a burger place can't walk across town and take the same job at another burger place and make a few bucks more. It just changed. But they just changed it because we exposed it. That was part of the deal, guys. Look it up. But not anymore. We're banning those agreements so companies have to compete for workers and pay them what they're worth. And I must tell you, this is bound to get a response from my friends on my left but the right. I'm so sick and tired of companies breaking the law by preventing workers from organizing. Pass the PRO Act, because businesses have a right, workers have a right to form a union. And let's guarantee all workers have a living wage. Let's make sure working parents can afford to raise a family with sick days, paid family medical leave, affordable child care. That's going to enable millions of more people to go and stay at work. And let's restore the full child tax credit, which gave tens of millions of parents some breathing room and cut child poverty in half to the lowest level in history. And by the way, when we do all these things, we increase productivity. We increase economic growth. So let's finish the job and get more families access to affordable, quality housing. Let's get seniors who want to stay in their homes the care they need to do so. Let's give more breathing room to millions of family caregivers looking after their loved ones. Pass my plan so we get seniors and people with disabilities the home care and services they need. And support the workers who are doing God's work. These plans are fully paid for, and we can afford to do them. Restoring the dignity of work means making education an affordable ticket to the middle class. You know, when we made public education, 12 years of it, universal in the last century, we made the best educated, best paid, we became the best educated, best paid nation in the world. But the rest of the world's caught up. It's caught up. Jill, my wife, who teaches full time, has an expression. I hope I get it right, kid. Any nation that out-educates us is going to out-compete us. Any nation that out-educates is going to out-compete us. Folks, we all know 12 years of education is not enough to win the economic competition of the 21st century. We want to have the best educated workforce. Let's finish the job by providing access to preschool for 3 and 4 years old. Studies show that children who go to preschool are nearly 50% more likely to finish high school and go on to earn a 2 or 4 year degree, no matter their background they came from. Let's give public school teachers a raise. We're making progress by reducing student debt, increasing Pell Grants for working and middle-class families. Let's finish the job and connect students to career opportunities starting in high school. Provide access to 2 years of community college, the best career training in America in addition to being a pathway to a 4-year degree. Let's offer every American a path to a good career, whether they go to college or not. And folks, in the midst of the COVID crisis, when schools were closed and we were shutting down everything, let's recognize how far we came in the fight against the pandemic itself. While the virus is not gone, thanks to the resilience of the American people and the ingenuity of medicine, we've broken the COVID grip on us. COVID deaths are down by 90%. We've saved millions of lives and opened up our country. We opened our country back up, and soon we'll end the public health emergency. But that's called a public health emergency. But we'll remember the toll and pain that's never going to go away. More than 1 million Americans lost their lives to COVID. 1 million. Families grieving, children orphaned, empty chairs at the dining room table constantly reminding you that she used to sit there. Remembering them, we remain vigilant. We still need to monitor dozens of variants and support new vaccines and treatments. So Congress needs to fund these efforts and keep America safe. And as we emerge from this crisis stronger, we're also got to double down on prosecuting criminals who stole relief money meant to keep workers and small businesses afloat. Before I came to office, you remember, during that campaign, the big issue was about inspector generals who would protect taxpayers' dollars who were sidelined. They were fired. Many people said we don't need them. And fraud became rampant. Last year, I told you the watchdogs are back. Since then, we've recovered billions of taxpayers' dollars. Now let's triple the anti-fraud strike force going after these criminals, double the statute of limitations on these crimes, and crack down on identity fraud by criminal syndicates stealing billions of dollars from the American people. And the data shows that for every dollar we put into fighting fraud, the taxpayers get back at least 10 times as much. It matters. It matters. Look, COVID left its scars, like the spike in violent crime in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. We have an obligation to make sure all people are safe. Public safety depends on public trust, as all of us know. But too often that trust is violated. Joining us tonight are the parents of Tyree Nichols. Welcome. We had to bury Tyree last week. As many of you personally know, there's no words to describe the heartache or grief of losing a child. But imagine if you lost that child at the hands of the law. Imagine having to worry whether your son or daughter came home from walking down the street, or playing in the park, or just driving a car. Most of us in here have never had to have the talk that brown and black parents have had to have with their children. Bo, Hunter, Ashley, my children, I never had to have the talk with them. I never had to tell them if a police officer pulls you over, turn your interior lights on right away. Don't reach for your license. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. Imagine having to worry like that every single time your kid got in a car. Here's what Tyree's mother shared with me when I spoke to her. When I asked her how she finds the courage to carry on and speak out. With the faith of God, she said her son was, quote, a beautiful soul, and something good will come of this. Imagine how much courage and character that takes. It's up to us, to all of us. We all want the same thing. Neighborhoods free of violence. Law enforcement who earns the community's trust. Just as every cop, when they pin on that badge in the morning, has a right to be able to go home at night, so does everybody else out there. Our children have a right to come home safely. Equal protection under the law is a covenant we have with each other in America. We know police officers put their lives on the line every single night and day. And we know we ask them in many cases to do too much, to be counselors, social workers, psychologists, responding to drug overdoses, mental health crises, and so much more. In one sense, we ask much too much of them. I know most cops and their families are good, decent, honorable people, the vast majority. But they risk their lives every time they put that shield on. But what happened to Tyree in Memphis happens too often. We have to do better. Give law enforcement the real training they need. Hold them to higher standards. Help them succeed in keeping us safe. We also need more first responders and professionals to address the growing mental health, substance abuse challenges. More resources to reduce violent crime and gun crime. More community intervention programs. More investment in housing, education, and job training. All this can help prevent violence in the first place. And when police officers or police departments violate the public trust, they must be held accountable. With the support of the families of victims, civil rights groups, and law enforcement, I signed an executive order for all federal officers banning chokeholds, restricting no-knock warrants, and other key elements of the George Floyd Act. Let's commit ourselves to make the words of Tyler's mom true. Something good must come from this. Something good. And all of us, folks, it's difficult, but it's simple. All of us in this chamber, we need to rise to this moment. We can't turn away. Let's do what we know in our hearts that we need to do. Let's come together to finish the job on police reform. Do something. Do something. That was the plea of parents who lost their children in Uvalde. I met with every one of them. Do something about gun violence. Thank God. Thank God we did. Passing the most sweeping gun safety law in 3 decades. That includes things like that the majority of responsible gun owners already support. Enhanced background checks for 18 to 21 years old. Red flag laws, keeping guns out of the hands of people who are a danger to themselves and others. But we know our work is not done. Joining us tonight is Brandon Say, a 26-year-old hero. Brandon put his college dreams on hold to be at his mom's side. His mom's side when she was dying from cancer. And Brandon now works at the dance studio started by his grandparents. And 2 weeks ago, during the Lunar New Year celebrations, he heard the studio door close, and he saw a man standing there pointing a semi-automatic pistol at him. He thought he was going to die, but he thought about the people inside. And in that instant, he found the courage to act and wrestle the semi-automatic pistol away from the gunman who had already killed 11 people in another dance studio. 11. He saved lives. It's time we do the same. Ban assault weapons now. Ban them now. Once and for all. I led the fight to do that in 1994. And in 10 years, that ban was law and mass shootings went down. After we let it expire in the Republican administration, mass shootings tripled. Let's finish the job and ban these assault weapons. And let's also come together on immigration. Make it a bipartisan issue once again. We know we now have a record number of personnel working to secure the border, arresting 8,000 human smugglers, seizing over 23,000 pounds of fentanyl in just the last several months. We've launched a new border plan last month. Unlawful migration from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela has come down 97% as a consequence of that. But American border problems won't be fixed until Congress acts. If we don't pass my comprehensive immigration reform, at least pass my plan to provide the equipment and officers to secure the border. And a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, those on temporary status, farm workers, essential workers. Here in the People's House, it's our duty to protect all the people's rights and freedoms. Congress must restore the right and the Congress must restore the right that was taken away in Roe v. Wade and protect Roe v. Wade. Give every woman a constitutional right. The Vice President and I are doing everything to protect access to reproductive health care and safeguard patient safety. But already more than a dozen states are enforcing extreme abortion bans. Make no mistake about it. If Congress passes a national ban, I will veto it. But let's also pass the Bipartisan Equality Act to ensure LGBTQ Americans, especially transgender young people, can live with safety and dignity. Our strength is not just the example of our power, but the power of our example. Let's remember the world's watching. I spoke from this chamber 1 year ago, just days after Vladimir Putin unleashed his brutal attack against Ukraine. A murderous assault, evoking images of death and destruction Europe suffered in World War II. Putin's invasion has been a test for the ages, a test for America, a test for the world. Would we stand for the most basic of principles? Would we stand for sovereignty? Would we stand for the right of people to live free of tyranny? Would we stand for the defense of democracy? For such defense matters to us because it keeps peace and prevents open season on would-be aggressors and threatens our prosperity. 1 year later, we know the answer. Yes, we would, and we did. We did. And together, we did what America always does at our best. We led. We united NATO. We built a global coalition. We stood against Putin's aggression. We stood with the Ukrainian people. Tonight, we're once again joined by Ukrainian's ambassador to the United States. She represents not just her nation, but the courage of her people. Our ambassador is here, united. We're united in our support of your country. Will you stand so we can all take a look at you? Thank you. Because we're going to stand with you as long as it takes. Our nation is working for more freedom, more dignity, more peace, not just in Europe, but everywhere. Before I came to office, the story was about how the People's Republic of China was increasing its power and America was failing in the world. Not anymore. We made clear, and I made clear in my personal conversations, which have been many, with President Xi, that we seek competition, not conflict. But I will make no apologies that we're investing to make America stronger, investing in American innovation and industries that will define the future that China intends to be dominating, investing in our alliances and working with our allies to protect advanced technologies so they will not be used against us, modernizing our military to safeguard stability and deter aggression. Today, we're in the strongest position in decades to compete with China or anyone else in the world. Anyone else in the world. And I'm committed. I'm committed to work with China where we can advance American interests and benefit the world. But make no mistake about it. As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did. Look. Let's be clear. Winning the competition should unite all of us. We face serious challenges across the world. But in the past 2 years, democracies have become stronger, not weaker. Autocracies have grown weaker, not stronger. Name me a world leader who changed places with Xi Jinping. Name me one. Name me one. America's rallying the world to meet those challenges, from climate to global health, to food insecurity, to terrorism, to territorial aggression. Allies are stepping up, spending more, and doing more. Look, the bridges we're forming between partners in the Pacific and those in the Atlantic, and those who bet against America are learning how wrong they are. It's never, ever been a good bet to bet against America. Never. came to office most assured that bipartisanship assumed was impossible, but never believed it. That's why a year ago I offered a unity agenda to the nation as I stood here. We made real progress together. We passed a law making it easy for doctors to prescribe effective treatments for opioid addiction. We passed the gun safety law, making historic investments in mental health. We launched the ARPA-H drive for breakthrough in the fights against cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes, and so much more. We passed the Heath Robinson PACT Act, named after the late Iraq War veteran whose story about exposure to toxic burn kits I shared here last year. I understand something about those burn pits, but there's so much more to do. We can do it together. Joining us tonight is a father named Doug from Newton, New Hampshire. He wrote Jill, my wife, a letter, and me as well, about his courageous daughter, Courtney. A contagious laugh, his sister's best friend, her sister's best friend. He shared a story all too familiar to millions of Americans and many of you in the audience. Courtney discovered pills in high school. It spiraled into addiction and eventually death from a fentanyl overdose. She was just 20 years old. Describing the last 8 years without her, Doug said, "There's no worse pain." Yet their family has turned pain to purpose, working to end the stigma and change laws. He told us he wants to start a journey toward American recovery. Doug, we're with you. Fentanyl is killing more than 70,000 Americans a year. Big, you got it. So let's launch a major surge to stop fentanyl production and the sale and trafficking, with more drug detection machines, inspection cargo, stop pills and powder at the border. Working with couriers like FedEx to inspect more packages for drugs. Strong penalties to crack down on fentanyl trafficking. Second, let's do more on mental health, especially for our children. When millions of young people are struggling with bullying, violence, trauma, we give them greater access to mental health care at their schools. We must finally hold social media companies accountable for experimenting they're doing running children for profit. It's time to pass bipartisan legislation to stop big tech from collecting personal data on our kids and teenagers online. Ban targeted advertising to children and impose stricter limits on the personal data that companies collect on all of us. Third, let's do more to keep this nation's one truly sacred obligation to equip those we send into harm's way and care for them and their families when they come home. Job training, job placement for veterans and their spouses as they come to return to civilian life. Helping veterans afford their rent, because no one should be homeless in America, especially someone who served the country. Dennis McDonough is here of the VA. We had a first real discussion when I asked him to take the job. I'm glad he did. We were losing up to 25 veterans a day on suicide. Now we're losing 17 a day to the silent scourge of suicide. 17 veterans a day are committing suicide. More than all the people being killed in the wars. Folks, VA is doing everything it can, including expanding mental health screening, proven programs that recruits veterans to help other veterans understand what they're going through, get them the help they need. We got to do more. And fourth, last year, Jill and I reignited the cancer moonshot that I was able to start with President Obama asked me to lead our administration on this issue. Our goal is to cut the cancer death rates at least by 50% in the next 25 years. turn more cancers from death sentences to treatable diseases, provide more support for patients and their families. It's personal to so many of us in this audience. Joining us are Morris and Candice, an Irishman and the daughter of immigrants from Panama. They met and fell in love in New York City and got married in the same chapel Jill and I got married in New York City. Kindred spirits. He wrote us a letter about his little daughter, Ava, and I saw her just before I came over. She was just a year old when she was diagnosed with rare kidney disease, cancer. After 26 blood transfusions, 11 rounds of radiation, 8 rounds of chemo, 1 kidney removed, giving a 5% survival rate. He wrote how in the darkest moments he thought, if she goes, I can't stay. Many of you have been through that as well. Jill and I understand that like so many of you. And he read Jill's book describing our family's cancer journey and how we tried to steal moments of joy where we could with Bo. For them, that glimmer of joy was the half smile of their baby girl. It meant everything to them. They never gave up hope. Little Ava never gave up hope. She turns 4 next month. They just found out Ava's beating the odds, is on her way to being cured of cancer. And she's watching from the White House tonight if she's not asleep already. For the lives we can save. For the lives we can save and the lives we've lost, let this be a truly American moment that rallies the country and the world together and proves that we can still do big things. 20 years ago, under the leadership of President Bush and countless advocates and champions, he undertook a bipartisan effort through PEPFAR to transform the global fight against HIV/AIDS. It's been a huge success. He thought big. He thought large. He moved. I believe we can do the same thing with cancer. Let's end cancer as we know it. Cure some cancers once and for all. Folks, there's one reason why we've been able to do all of these things. Our democracy itself. It's the most fundamental thing of all. With democracy, everything's possible. Without it, nothing is. For the last few years, our democracy has been threatened and attacked, put at risk, put to the test in this very room on January the 6th. And then just a few months ago, an unhinged big lie assailed and unleashed a political violence, the home of the then Speaker of the House of Representatives, using the very same language the insurrectionists used as they stalked these halls and chanted on January 6th. Here tonight in this chamber is a man who bears the scars of that brutal attack, but is as tough and as strong and as resilient as they get. My friend Paul Pelosi. Paul, stand up. But such a heinous act should have never happened. We must all speak out. There's no place for political violence in America. We have to protect the right to vote, not suppress the fundamental right. Honor the results of our elections, not subvert the will of the people. We have to uphold the rule of law and restore trust in our institutions of democracy. And we must give hate and extremism in any form no safe harbor. Democracy must not be a partisan issue. It's an American issue. Every generation of Americans has faced a moment where they have been called to protect our democracy, defend it, stand up for it. And this is our moment. My fellow Americans, we meet tonight at an inflection point, one of those moments that only a few generations ever face, where the direction we now take is going to decide the course of this nation for decades to come. We're not bystanders of history. We're not powerless before the forces that confront us. It's within our power of we, the people. We're facing the test of our time. We have to be the nation we've always been at our best. Optimistic, hopeful, forward-looking. A nation that embraces light over dark, hope over fear, unity over division, stability over chaos. We have to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow Americans. We're good people. The only nation in the world built on an idea, the only one. Other nations are defined by geography, ethnicity, but we're the only nation based on an idea that all of us, every one of us, is created equal in the image of God. A nation that stands as a beacon of the world. A nation in a new age of possibilities. So I've come to fulfill my constitutional obligation to report in the State of the Union. And here's my report. Because the soul of this nation is strong, because the backbone of this nation is strong, because the people of this nation are strong, the State of the Union is strong. I'm not new to this place. I stand here tonight having served as long as about any one of you have ever served here. But I've never been more optimistic about our future, about the future of America. We just have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America, and there's nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. The President of the United States delivering his second State of the Union, but his first to a divided Congress with Republicans now in control of the House, promising unity, exhorting Republicans to try and work with him on a number of different issues to, in his words, finish the job of repairing America's unsettled economy and working towards a better democracy. John Dickerson, it was also a blueprint for a future run for president.
It sure was, and setting up also the terms of the first big clash with Republicans over spending cuts and the debt ceiling, talking at length about tax increases on the wealthy as a way of raising revenue in this coming fight, which will be the first defining fight of this new relationship. And obviously, there will be lots of investigations, but really trying to box Republicans in on that. And then, of course, on a whole host of other proposals as well that he's putting forward that he says will reduce the deficit.
This was the president's longest address so far to Congress. 1 hour, 12 minutes, 40 seconds, one of the longer speeches by President Biden, who has been known to be loquacious throughout his career. But one of the other things I think we should note tonight, too, Nancy Cordes, is the reaction from Republicans tonight. Speaker Kevin McCarthy is trying to present a new image, standing on many occasions, but there were a lot of disruptions from the crowd.
Norah, we've seen Republican hecklers at States of the Union before, but this time the speech almost turned into a call and response at some point. And at least 4 times the House Speaker had to visibly shush members of his party because they were shouting out at the President of the United States. They called him a liar. They accused him of causing the fentanyl crisis, and on as we went through various issues. So definitely was not what the House Speaker was seeking this evening.
But I would note that, we kind of got a precursor to that with that Speaker election just a couple weeks ago, where we saw at one point a lawmaker almost lunge at another because things were so tense and heated. So I kind of feel like people got to witness what I got to see just a couple of weeks ago.
I want to bring in Scott McFarland. He is inside the House chamber. What was the reaction there when, for instance, we heard Marjorie Taylor Greene shouting at the president, calling him a liar?
What you can't see on TV is the crowd in the upper level, these guests, these citizens who came with members of Congress. It was so jarring. You could see it in their body language. You could see it in their facial expressions. When the heckling grew in intensity and it grew in volume as the speech went along. When Marjorie Taylor Greene yelled liar, it was visibly jarring to some in the chamber. When a House Republican yelled, "It's your fault," when President Biden mentioned the fentanyl crisis, it was jarring, but something else stood out to me. The standing ovation near the end for Paul Pelosi, who was sitting in the same area of the chamber. Many of these members of Congress were trapped on January 6, 2021. There were several in the House Republican side of the chamber who did not stand and did not applaud. And we are 2 years later. There's a black metal fence surrounding this compound in a post-January 6 world. And there still seems to be a wedge over political violence, political attacks, and to a degree, January 6th itself.
Scott McFarland, thank you. I want to note now the president speaking to his top military advisors, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, General McConville, and a lawmaker praising his remarks. I don't want to let the theatrics from inside the House chamber distract from some of the substance that was discussed by the president, talking about his infrastructure program, pledging that most of the materials should be made in America if they are a federal contract. Drug prices, capping insulin at $35 a month if you're on Medicare, and then talking about a cap of $2,000 a year for all drugs, which has got to be very popular among seniors who are facing high drug prices.
Right, but that doesn't take effect until 2026. So that's when we were talking about not feeling the economic benefits that the president wants to read off as accomplishments. That's one of the problems with some of these bills, is the sequencing of it. You know, I thought, Norah, it was also interesting. There was a little bit of box checking, I think. Abortion, which we talked about so much in the midterm races, just 4 lines in this speech, perhaps an acknowledgement that no legislation is likely on either side to progress and make it to his desk, but he did say he'd veto it if somehow a ban passed the Senate, which it won't, which Democrats control. Also talked about oil and gas. I thought there were 2 interesting ad libs there, and I would have loved to have seen who was grumbling exactly when he said, no, we will be dependent on oil and gas for 10 to 15 years. That was embedded in that segment where he was talking about the green energy transition, something that is within his party very popular, and he will likely want to run on. There were a number of things. Also an ad lib in the section on China that was so interesting, where it's supposed to be lowering the temperature, but he said a few times, name me one leader who would want to change places with Xi Jinping. That may be received as a bit of an insult in Beijing.
I mean, this was no doubt embarrassing for the Chinese to know that their spy balloon had been uncovered and then shot down. But then the president seemed to really try and stick it to Xi tonight publicly. Be curious to see how that goes over, as you point out. Robert Costa, what stood out to you in the president's remarks tonight?
What a portrait of President Biden as a politician. Yes, he's a former vice president. He's 2 years into his own presidency. But we saw tonight with the call and response, as Nancy said, is someone who really understands legislation. He enjoyed, it seemed, the back and forth with the Republicans on Medicare, on Social Security, calling them out for the party's past positions on long-term federal spending, almost negotiating the debt limit in front of the country, saying to McCarthy behind him, you better keep your party on that position. And so this is a president who seems to be embracing divided government as an opportunity for him to stretch political and legislative muscles that he has honed over decades.
Nicole Killian, one of the other things he brought up, of course, is what happened with Tyree Nichols, the parents there in the audience, emotional as they were talking about his son. And yet, well, the president's been pushing, as well as there have been some bipartisan moves in Congress, it doesn't look like anything may get done.
Well, and I think you saw the president. I think one thing that struck me is that his message on that was just do something. He didn't necessarily lay out what to do. And that contrasts with, for instance, what we heard him say in his joint address back in 2021, where at the time he called for Congress to get a bill with George Floyd's name on it, by the anniversary of his death. No timeline, no timetable, no specifics on what he wants to see, and that could be intentional. We know he met with the Congressional Black Caucus last week. We know at this point that things are still in a very early phase. People are looking to the Senate to see if Cory Booker and Tim Scott will resurrect negotiations. The House, there's some lawmakers, Sheila Jackson Lee, who's working on legislation as well. So I think there's still some strategizing there in terms of the path forward, which may be why the president was less specific tonight.
It's a good point. The president talking about that law enforcement needs more training, needs more mental health support. The president also concerned, not mentioning tonight, but in other occasions, the president's talked about too, cities and communities are having trouble hiring cops. No one wants to be in a cop anymore because of what's happening. So there's got to be a lot of police reform on all sides of this that Congress will at some point need to take a look at. I want to bring in Ashley Etienne. She has served in the past for Presidents Obama and then Vice President Biden, as well as worked up on the Hill. What did you hear in that part, Ashley?
I mean, what I was most struck by is the fact that the line that the president said that police should be held accountable for violating public trust got an applause line from both Democrats and Republicans. In fact, McCarthy stood up and clapped at that moment. I mean, I think he probably stood up a total of 5 times. To have him stand up on that line shows a tremendous amount of progress on this particular issue. I was part of drafting George Floyd and the whole campaign to get that bill jump-started. And so it warms my heart to really see that there could be some progress on this particular issue. I think it gives us a lot of hope, the CBC, as well as others that have been fighting for this issue for a long time. There's new members in the Republican caucus that want to do something on this bill. Congressman John James, for example, has reached out to the CBC saying he wants to be helpful. So for me, I think that's what I was most struck by, is that line got an applause from both sides of the chamber.
Leslie Sanchez is also with us, has worked with a number of Republicans. And Leslie, I have to ask you about some of that jujitsu, if you will, that President Biden played on Medicare and Social Security. At one point, accusing Republicans of wanting to cut those entitlement reforms. Then I think he got a liar shout from the crowd at that. And then he said, OK, I guess we all agree we're not going to cut Medicare and Social Security, despite that there are some Republicans who have talked about the only way to cut the federal budget is to tackle entitlement reform.
I think it was a very important pushback, though very vocal, Norah, at the time. But Speaker McCarthy has specifically said, even on Face the Nation, our program, that cuts to Social Security and Medicare were not an option, that they were going to look at long-term sustainability. So to say that that is on the agenda as if it's a consensus among the conference is just a bold lie. And I feel that's why Republicans, not only in the hall, in the chamber, but also I think on social and the chatter is going to be that disconnect between where Republicans stand on Medicare, Medicaid, and certainly Social Security.
But if you talk to Paul Ryan, if you talk to Senator Rick Scott, if you actually look at the pie of the federal budget, they'll say there is no other way to do it than to actually tackle entitlement
This
reform.
position the Republicans are now taking on Medicare and Social Security is such a testament to the influence of former President Donald Trump, who ran against the Ryan, Romney, Rick Scott version of the Republican Party, at least on federal spending. And it's indicative of his influence, even though his run hasn't exactly caught fire so far for 2024. Who's giving the response tonight? His former White House press secretary.
Let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, on this matter, too, because I know you took notice about that particular discussion on those entitlement reforms.
That was one of the most fascinating exchanges, partly because it was unscripted, but also because it was an acknowledgement by Republicans that, no, they're not going to do that. And they're not going to do that after suffering for suggesting for doing so for the last 20 years or so. As you said, Paul Ryan, John Boehner, other Republicans who had put that on the table had said it needed to be done, now admitting it can't. Well, if it can't, then what more are they going to potentially negotiate over? The Speaker continues to say there needs to be cuts in wasteful spending, but it won't be in the defense budget necessarily. It won't come from Social Security and Medicare. It leaves a very small percentage of the federal budget left to be debated over. And watch the president bring this up again potentially tomorrow when he goes to Wisconsin to talk about workers' issues broadly. And then Thursday when he goes to Tampa, Florida, with a specific focus on the future of Social Security and Medicare. Does he bring it up again? Or does he try to suggest that what happened tonight signals it won't be touched, and instead the system can be strengthened, and the debate over raising the debt limit can be found elsewhere? But a really fascinating exchange, amid what you guys have already pointed out was a pretty raucous night. I cannot recall a House Speaker sitting there at the dais before trying to shush members of his caucus and trying to get them to be respectful. Calls had gone out throughout the day here. Remember, the eyes of the world are on you guys now. We are in charge of this chamber. We have to demonstrate some sense of leadership and decorum. That did not happen tonight repeatedly on the issue of Social Security and Medicare, the debate over China, and how to fight fentanyl.
But the president was, to be fair, oversimplifying that. It's not a cut or don't cut, right? There are parts of these trust funds that run out in 2023 and 2028. These are layered deadlines. This is going to be complicated. As you just referenced, entitlement reform at some point does need to be discussed. So when he said extend it for 2 decades, the Medicare trust fund, we're going to be hearing more about this, I feel, in the months to come. And part of the debate is not cut it for those receiving it now, but adjust it for those receiving it in the future. In other words, people at this table who might be recipients in future.
Right.
It's not going to look like it does now.
Usually, I mean, certainly George W. Bush tried to do it with private accounts and Social Security. You know, once you talk about long-term sustainability, pretty soon the conversation gets back to you're making a cut. And as Bob said, it's an amazing thing to see the Republican Party saying, no. It used to be a sign of how bold you were, that you could come up with a plan for taking care of Medicare and Social Security, and that was your proof that you were a real Republican. Now, the proof is that you don't want to mess with either of those two things. It's an extraordinary change in the Republican Party that we've covered. One other tiny thing, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, governor of Arkansas, has chosen tonight to put a face on the party that is new, dynamic, young, not in Washington. She now has to compete with the hecklers, who also are offering a vision of the country, what the Republican Party stands for. That's not exactly what their plan was.
She has nodded to that in her own governance, though, in her first few days, in terms of indulging in what some of us would call culture war issues, taking stances on things that may not even be taught in classroom in most elementary schools, for example, or phrasing. So she has dabbled in that a bit herself. I don't know that we'll hear about that tonight, but it is such an interesting choice. She is the youngest governor, the first female governor of that state, and to have her be the choice of change at a time when so many people remember her as the spokesperson for the Trump administration.
But she's competing against Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene tonight for attention. I mean, you think back to Joe Wilson, the congressman from South Carolina, when he yelled, "You lie," at President Obama. It was a seismic moment in American politics. It almost seems like it's cascading over the scene now as just another interruption in a chaotic political war.
And the reason reprimanded for that, and the question is, will Marjorie Taylor Greene get reprimanded?
The control over the caucus.
But his fundraising also skyrocketed, and that's the change, is that Marjorie Taylor Greene will probably also see a benefit from this. And then in politics that's driven by attention and fundraising, shouting out, and where norms aren't maintained, shouting out is actually perfectly fine if you're a chaos entrepreneur in the political realm these days.
Norah, I want to point out there was a big question going into the speech whether the president was going to reference the balloon shoot down that had the nation transfixed over the weekend, and if so, how. It turns out he did mention it, but only obliquely in one line in the speech. He said, as we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country. And we did. That got a big applause line in the room. And that answers the question of how and whether he thought it was going to be important enough to actually insert that incident into the speech.
The oblique reference that we talked about.
The challenge has been that that China tried to cross or set a line that the president allowed them to violate our sovereignty without a strong response. So clearly he felt the need to respond to it in that way. Tonight, I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. And Major, part of the president's speech sounded like his inaugural address, didn't you think? And he shared the same speechwriter.
The point I want to make, Norah, is parts of the president's speech tonight sounded like President Trump's 2017 inaugural address. He didn't say American carnage, but what did the president say tonight? He said 40 years of neglect, of bad trade policy, of bipartisan neglect of American jobs and made in America, of people feeling like they were invisible. Go back to President Trump's inaugural address in 2017. Those are very similar sentiments. And the reason I point that out is we're all talking about the expected announcement of President Biden's re-election campaign. What was the big conversation that Democrats had after the 2016 surprise victory of Donald Trump and the surprise defeat of Hillary Clinton? That they had lost the ability to talk to that middle part of America that felt abandoned, overlooked, or felt invisible through the economic turmoil of our times. Tonight's speech is the clearest articulation, using some of that very same metaphorical language that President Trump did in 2017 about being invisible, overlooked, about 40 years of neglect from both parties, not making things in America, exporting jobs and not bringing them back. All those sort of sentiments, not as harsh, again, no American carnage, but compare the speeches in those sections, they were very, very similar. That is a clear signal to me that in addition to picking on big pharma and asking for higher taxes on the wealthy, typical Democratic approaches, that language itself is distinguished to me in contrast to earlier Biden speeches and a clear signal he is ramping up for a re-election bid.
It's an interesting point, Major Garrett. Thank you. Except I recall President Trump's inaugural as being incredibly pessimistic, and clearly Biden was trying to strike an optimistic note in these remarks here. It was probably one of the best speeches that President Biden has ever given. He has struggled in the past on long speeches. When he ad-libs, he sometimes mispronounces things. He speaks off the cuffs and makes mistakes. He made some tonight, but this was one of his better performances, and it looked like the speechwriters, to me, had finally learned Biden's syntax.
Right. You didn't hear a single acronym in that speech, for example. He kept the language as simple as possible. They put a lot of work into this speech. They clearly felt that the stakes were very high. We're heading into a re-election bid that could be just a couple of weeks away. They know that the attention is on him. They know that people have questions about whether he can pull off another 4 years. And so they spent the entire weekend sequestered at Camp David working on this speech. It's clear when you watch him give speech after speech that with this one, he spent a lot of time going over it, reading it, rewriting it, and getting comfortable with it.
And working with John Meacham, the noted former editor of Newsweek and author.
Pulitzer Prize-winning historian.
Yes.
Yeah, especially the end of the speech, when you could start to feel the orchestral music coming. That felt like it was from John. Back to Major's point, because President Trump talked about the forgotten man, but he said you won't be forgotten any longer, as I recall from that speech. And this is the question, is whether Joe Biden, with his more gentle delivery, grabs the same thing that former President Trump grabbed, which was that sense of grievance. And you heard a little bit of it when he talked about the junk bills and all the billionaires and the fees and so forth, and he's accessing that. But the question is this economic or is it cultural? And does President Biden have the same ability to really grab that vote if he's not making those cultural plays?
And President Biden, one of the last to leave the chamber tonight, as he is known to want to shake hands and say hello to everyone. We're going to come back in just a moment. And when we do, we're going to hear from Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She will have the Republican response to tonight's State of the Union. Welcome back to CBS News coverage of President Biden's State of the Union. Now we go from America's oldest president to the country's youngest governor, Arkansas' Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She is the first woman to hold that position in the state. And you may remember the new governor from her time as White House press secretary in the Trump administration. Want to bring our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, back with us because I know he spoke with Sanders' office today. What did you learn?
Yep. So Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell selected Sarah Huckabee Sanders because she has credibility in the Trump world, but she's not going to run for president or even thinking about it in 2024. And they did want to have the Republican response occupied by someone who might, to aggravate former President Trump. And they also wanted a youthful voice who was a midterm success story for Republicans when those are somewhat hard to find. Will Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders wade into the culture wars? Indeed, she will. She will say that Republicans are under siege from the woke left, having to wage a fight against cultural wokeism that they didn't start and they don't want to fight. It's worth indicating that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, born in Hope, Arkansas, as was William Jefferson Clinton. It was in 1992 when Bill Clinton became president that Pat Buchanan gave a speech at the Republican National Convention declaring, you guessed it, a culture war.
Major Garrett, thank you so much. We want to go now to the governor of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
I'm Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Being a mom to 3 young children taught me not to believe every story I hear. So forgive me for not believing much of anything I heard tonight from President Biden. From out-of-control inflation and violent crime to the dangerous border crisis and threat from China, Biden and the Democrats have failed you. They know it, and you know it. And it's time for a change. Tonight, let us reaffirm our commitment to a timeless American idea that government exists not to rule the people, but to serve the people. Democrats want to rule us with more government control, but that's not who we are. America is the greatest country the world has ever known because we're the freest country the world has ever known, with a people who are strong and resilient. 5 months ago, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. It was a hard time for our family, particularly our kids, Scarlett, Huck, and George. But we kept our faith and persevered. Thanks to exceptional doctors here in Arkansas, a successful surgery, and the grace of God, I am cancer-free. Through it all, I couldn't help but think about my mom. She was 20 years old and in her first year of marriage when she was diagnosed with spinal cancer. The doctors told her she might not live, and if she did live, they said she'd never walk again. And if she did walk, she'd definitely never have children. The daughter she was told she'd never have was just sworn in as the new governor of Arkansas and is speaking to you tonight. Adversity and fear of the unknown can paralyze us, but faith propels us to charge boldly ahead. We can't stand still in the face of great challenges. You and I were put on this earth for such a time as this, to charge boldly ahead. I'll be the first to admit, President Biden and I don't have a lot in common. I'm for freedom, he's for government control. At 40, I'm the youngest governor in the country. And at 80, he's the oldest president in American history. I'm the first woman to lead my state, and he's the first man to surrender his presidency to a woke mob that can't even tell you what a woman is. In the radical left's America, Washington taxes you and lights your hard-earned money on fire. But you get crushed with high gas prices, empty grocery shelves, and our children are taught to hate one another on account of their race, but not to love one another or our great country. Whether Joe Biden believes this madness or is simply too weak to resist it, his administration has been completely hijacked by the radical left. The dividing line in America is no longer between right or left. The choice is between normal or crazy. It's time for a new generation of Republican leadership. Upon taking office just a few weeks ago, I signed executive orders to ban CRT, racism, and indoctrination in our schools, eliminate the use of derogatory term Latinx in our government, repealed COVID orders, and said never again to authoritarian mandates and shutdowns. Americans want common sense from their leaders, but in Washington, the Biden administration is doubling down on crazy. President Biden inherited the fastest economic recovery on record, the most secure border in history, cheap, abundant, homegrown energy, fast rising wages, a rebuilt military, and a world that was stable and at peace. But over the last 2 years, Democrats destroyed it all. Despite Democrats' trillions in reckless spending and mountains of debt, we now have the worst border crisis in American history. As a mom, my heart breaks for every parent who has lost a son or daughter to addiction. 100,000 Americans a year are now killed from drug overdoses. largely from fentanyl pouring across our southern border. Yet the Biden administration refuses to secure the border and save American lives. And after years of Democrat attacks on law enforcement and calls to defund the police, violent criminals roam free, while law-abiding families live in fear. Beyond our border, from Afghanistan to Ukraine, from North Korea to Iran, President Biden's weakness puts our nation and the world at risk. And the president's refusal to stand up to China, our most formidable adversary, is dangerous and unacceptable. President Biden is unwilling to defend our border, defend our skies, and defend our people. He is simply unfit to serve as commander-in-chief. And while you reap the consequences of their failures, the Biden administration seems more interested in woke fantasies than the hard reality Americans face every day. Most Americans simply want to live their lives in freedom and peace. But we are under attack in a left-wing culture war we didn't start and never wanted to fight. Every day we are told we must partake in their rituals, salute their flags, and worship their false idols, all while big government colludes with big tech to strip away the most American thing there is, your freedom of speech. That's not normal. It's crazy, and it's wrong. Make no mistake, Republicans will not surrender this fight. We will lead with courage and do what's right, not what's politically correct or convenient. Republicans believe in an America where strong families thrive in safe communities, where jobs are abundant and paychecks are rising, where the freedom our veterans shed their blood to defend is the birthright of every man, woman, and child. These are the principles Republican governors are fighting for, and in Washington, under the leadership of Senate Republicans and Speaker Kevin McCarthy, we will hold the Biden administration accountable. Down the street from where I sit is my alma mater, Little Rock Central High. As a student there, I will never forget watching my dad, Governor Mike Huckabee, and President Bill Clinton hold the doors open to the Little Rock Nine. Doors that 40 years earlier had been closed to them because they were Black. Today, those children once barred from the schoolhouse are now heroes memorialized in bronze at our State House. I'm proud of the progress our country has made, and I believe giving every child access to a quality education, regardless of their race or income, is the civil rights issue of our day. Tomorrow, I will unveil an education package that will be the most far-reaching, bold, conservative education reform in the country. My plan empowers parents with real choices, improves literacy and career readiness, and helps put a good teacher in every classroom by increasing their starting salary from one of the lowest to one of the highest in the nation. Here in Arkansas and across America, Republicans are working to end the policy of trapping kids in failing schools and sentencing them to a lifetime of poverty. We will educate, not indoctrinate our kids, and put students on a path to success. It's time for a new generation to lead. This is our moment. This is our opportunity. A new generation born in the waning decades of the last century, shaped by economic booms and stock market busts, forged by the triumph of the Cold War and the tragedy of 9/11. A generation brimming with passion and new ideas to solve age-old problems. A generation moored to our deepest values and oldest traditions, yet unafraid to challenge the present order and find a better way forward. If we seize this moment together, America can once again be the land of the free and the home of the brave. During my 2.5 years at the White House, I traveled on every foreign trip with the president. A trip I will never forget was on December 25th of 2018. My husband Brian and I had just cleaned up wrapping paper that was shoved into every corner of our house, thanks to our 3 kids. When I had to walk out on my own family's Christmas, unable to tell them where I was going that night, because the place I'd be traveling was so dangerous, they didn't want anybody to know that the president was going to be on the ground, even for a few hours. We boarded Air Force One in complete and total darkness. There were no lights on the plane, no lights on the runway. Our phones and computers shut down and turned in. We were going completely off the grid. Nearly 12 hours later, in the pitch black of night, we landed in the war-torn part of Western Iraq. It was again a similar scene. No lights on the plane, no lights on the runway. The only thing you could see was coming from about a mile away in a dining hall where hundreds of troops who were in the fight against ISIS had gathered expecting to celebrate Christmas with senior military leadership from around the region. They had absolutely no idea that the president and first lady were about to walk into that room. And when they did, it was a sight and a scene and a sound I hope I never forget. The room erupted. Men and women from every race, religion, and region, every political party, every demographic you can imagine, started chanting in perfect unison over and over and over again, USA, USA, USA. It was an absolutely perfect picture of what makes our country great. One of the young soldiers yelled from the back, "Mr. President, I re-enlisted in the military because of you." And the president said, "And son, I'm here because of you." Shortly after, that young soldier came up to me. He said, "Sarah, you have a tough job." I told him, "What I do is nothing. You take bombs and bullets. That's a tough job." And in a moment that I know I'll cherish for the rest of my life, that soldier reached up and he pulled the Brave Rifles patch he wore on his shoulder, and he placed it into my hand, a sign of ultimate respect. And he said, "Sarah, we are in this together." Overwhelmed with emotion and speechless, I just hugged him with tears in my eyes and a grateful heart for our heroes who keep us free. That young man and everyone who has served before him, all of those who serve alongside him, and the thousands we know who will be called upon to serve after him, deserve to know they have a country and a community back home doing our part in the fight for freedom. America is great because we are free. But today, our freedom is under attack, and the America we love is in danger. President Biden and the Democrats have failed you, and it's time for a change. A new generation of Republican leaders are stepping up, not to be caretakers of the status quo, but to be change makers for the American people. We know not what the future holds, but we know who holds the future in his hands. And with God as our witness, we will show the world that America is still the place where freedom reigns and liberty will never die. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless America.
And there, Governor Huckabee Sanders there delivering a strong message representing the Republican side, claiming that President Biden is unfit to serve as commander-in-chief and using the word crazy 3 times to describe his policies. Nancy Cordes.
Tough case to make after you just saw members of her own party there in the House chamber heckling the president of the United States. But she went right after President Biden. This was not a speech that was designed to attract the middle. This was squarely designed at the base of her own party. She said he was weak. She said he was unfit to be president. You mentioned she called them crazy. Said they had surrendered to the woke mob, said that more than once. Clearly, this was the red meat that her party was looking for.
Response speeches are not policy heavy, and this was in that tradition. I think the only real policy was school choice, which would make a really interesting case to make if you were trying to say, this is how I'm characterizing an administration, and here are policies that are better than that. That wasn't done. It wasn't really, as you say, it wasn't an argument. It was just attaching a bunch of labels to him, and she had many at the ready to attach.
But is this a reminder that the party has not turned the page on the Trump presidency, as there are many in the Republican Party that say we want new, younger leaderships that's detached from Trump or different from? It's a sign that he still is just as powerful as ever on the ideas of the party.
They're not only not turning the page, they're turning up the volume. Her speech tonight was an introduction to her as a political figure for a national audience. It was also an echo of what we've been hearing from so many Republicans across the country, especially the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, a possible 2024 foil for President Biden.
Well, it emphasized that the sense of grievance has not gone away. America is changing, and you are likely uncomfortable with it. That's the reference to woke and, phrasing on how to refer to people correctly. This "they're weird, you're not" idea is what she was appealing to here. That's that Trumpism that isn't necessarily just the man. It's something the party is tapping into in America that you're uncomfortable with. But she did try to reference the fact that she's the youngest governor versus the oldest president, trying to reference transition for the party. But as you said, they're not necessarily ready to transition just yet.
Yeah, and I would just say very briefly, just the normal versus crazy. This is also rhetoric we've heard from Democrats as well, and I think that also kind of explains some of the dynamics we witnessed in Congress tonight. The question is, will we continue to witness those dynamics, or will they actually work together as the president called for tonight?
Thanks to all of you for your brilliant analysis and reporting in our coverage of the State of the Union. We'll continue on your late local news on the CBS station. Tomorrow, Vice President Kamala Harris joins CBS Mornings. And thank you to all of our incredible team here at CBS News. I'm Norah O'Donnell here in the nation's capital. Good night.